we repeatedly invited KB Homes to come and be present tonight, present their information and answer your questions. And like Brandeis, they had refused to appear on camera to be interviewed by NBC, and they have declined to appear here today to answer your questions. So I will try to present the data that exists as best I can, and then we will answer your questions. So KB, the Runkle Canyon matter is interesting in terms of a series of tests, many of which the public was never informed about for many years. The prior developer, called Green Park, brought in a contractor secretly in 1999-98 called QST, asking them to do measurements of the soil at Runkle because of concern that there might possibly be some contamination from Santa Susana. And the 1999 study only took a handful of samples. The purpose of the investigation, I'm quoting now from their study, was to determine if operations conducted at the adjacent Rocketdyne facility had impacted on-site soils at Runkle, based on surface runoff carrying radionuclides to the site. Results of the investigation will determine if further site investigation is necessary for the subject site. So they were concerned that there could be Santa Susana contamination, they wanted to take measurements. If they found anything, they would have to do further investigation. So what did they find? The analytic results of the soil samples indicated the presence of strontium. Strontium-90 is a very dangerous radioactive material, half-life of about 30 years, meaning it's dangerous for about 600. It mimics calcium, so it goes to the bone, concentrates there, or can cause bone cancer or leukemia. So the samples collected in these areas that they looked at ranged from 0.25 to 0.86, and these exceeded the EPA measured average local background concentration of 0.052. So you can just see this is roughly 15 times above background. What did they conclude? Based on the analytical results of the soil samples, it would appear that there may have been some impact of radionuclides to the site from the Rocketdyne facility. Consequently, a more extensive site investigation appears to be necessary to determine the lateral and vertical impact of radionuclides in the soil. Developer's own contractor. The city of Simi Valley issued a draft EIR that formed the basis for approving the project. And in that draft EIR, it made the following statements. I'm quoting now. Previous assessments of strontium-90 and tritium within the vicinity of the Runkle Canyon area included a survey by QST Environmental in 1998. The results of the survey indicated that the surface soil contained concentrations of cesium-137 and strontium-90 that exceeded background levels established by the EPA. So far, so accurate. Consequently, further testing was indicated. But then the EIR concludes that further testing found that radiation levels were within normal background levels. Tritium and strontium-90 were not detected in any of the soil and groundwater samples at levels above normal background levels or at levels considered to pose a health risk. And on that basis, the city said 4 samples have been made by QST, extensive subsequent testing was done, and none of that subsequent testing, they said back a decade ago, found any strontium-90 above background or above any health level. Quite reassuring. So I went to the city and asked to see the data, and the city told me they didn't have the data. They had made that statement without actually having any of the measurements. So County Supervisor Linda Parks requested from the developer the measurements and obtained them. And there were 4 different contractors that the original developer had hired one after another to measure for radioactivity. QST found it. They then hired Foster Wheeler. They then hired 2 more companies after that, and I'll explain why in a moment. And you saw the summary by the city, suggesting that the subsequent measurements found everything was fine. So these documents, by the way, were stamped attorney-client privilege, confidential. There's no reason radiation measurements should be confidential, should be attorney-client privilege. At least they did release it after they got their approval when there was a request from a county supervisor. So I took the data from the Foster-Wheeler study and I compared it to EPA's local background levels. And you can see a red line down at the bottom here. That red line is EPA's background value, 0.0735 picocuries per gram. The blue are the actual strontium measurements. And they were as high as 70 times background, 87 times background, and one was 168 times background. You will see that essentially all of them are above background when the EIR said that these subsequent measurements were all below background. Here is the comparison of the Foster-Wheeler measurements at Runkle Ranch against the EPA's preliminary remediation goal. Now you will remember that they said in addition to being at or below background, it was at or below any health protective level. Same story. The red line is EPA's preliminary remediation goal of 0.063 picocuries per gram. And the strontium 90 found in Runkle soil from the developer's own study were as high as 77 times the EPA value, 96 times, and one was 186 times. I was really puzzled. How could the city say one thing, but the measurements say the other, and how would the city say those things without actually getting the data? It turns out that after the second study, this Foster-Wheeler one found elevated strontium 90, the developer decided to bring in a third contractor, perhaps hoping that the third contractor wouldn't find anything. And here is what the third contractor found. I don't know if you can see this. I apologize if you can't. The third contractor was Hardy ESE, and they found strontium 90 as high as 63 times EPA's background and as high as 72 times EPA's suburban residential preliminary radiation goal. So the developer didn't give up. The developer brought in a fourth contractor. And that fourth contractor found as high as 29 times background and 33 times the EPA's preliminary remediation goal. That was the first developer. Those were the four different contractors. And yet that information apparently never made it to the city. And instead the city was told that all of these measurements after QST came back clean and all came back dirty. So that became public a few years ago, and the new developer, KB Homes, brought in a fifth contractor, Dave Moeller. And there was controversy about Dave Moeller before even any measurements were made. Members of the public said that they had heard things about Dave Moeller that caused them to question whether you kind of got the answer that you wanted from them. Moeller himself had been removed from the National Academy of Sciences Committee on Radiation because of allegations about conflicts of interest and bias. So Moeller was brought in, and Moeller did 3 different sets of measurements over the years. I'll show you that in a second. And in 2005, Moeller found 6 times background, 6 times the remediation goal. 2007, the Moeller investigation, where there were some split samples, found nothing. And then the most recent in 2010 found it at 5 times the preliminary remediation goal. So they're still finding strontium 90, but at lower levels than were found by the earlier studies. And what you heard is that Greg Dempsey, the EPA's radiation specialist, had urged DTSC and Dave Moeller to not use a particular old technique for measuring strontium 90, but to use a more modern one where it was less easy to get erroneous results. The irony here is that the older tests generally use the more modern technique, and the newer tests generally use the older, less reliable technique. One last thing. Strontium 90, if it was airborne fallout from open burning of radioactive waste in the burn pit, or from releases from the meltdown, or from other accidents, tends to deposit on the soil and be there in the top few inches, right on the top surface. So if you take a sample that is deeper down, 6 inches or a foot down, at the very same location, you can get a lower reading than if you took the sample at the surface. So it is possible, if you want to get a low reading, or if you screw up, you can get it, even though there is a higher value present. So the Toxics Agency, under pressure from lobbyists from KB Homes, decided that in the face of 4 prior studies by 4 contractors, they would ignore those 4 and go with the Dave Moeller one and approve the project. And that is why there is this large question hanging over us about Runkle Ranch. At the time DTSC gave that approval, they said they didn't think there really was strontium-90 and that there couldn't have come from the field laboratory, but if the EPA study of the field lab found strontium-90 on the field lab property, they would reconsider. I just want to see if we can find that again, just so you can remember how it looks. Where are we? Yeah, here, okay? So here's Runkle Canyon, where they're finding strontium-90. EPA under Greg Dempsey was measuring for strontium-90 in the soil on the other side of the boundary line. And what did Dempsey find? Strontium-90 in lots of locations here. Completely consistent with the release. And if there was a release, or releases, there's just no reason to think that the air or the water would recognize the site boundary on the map. So you have strontium-90 measurements made here that everyone believes. Strontium-90 measurements made here that DTSC decided to presume might be inaccurate, and without being able to prove that they were, went ahead and approved this project. Let's see if I have anything else for you. So that's it. So why don't we take some questions, if you have any, and we'll do our best to answer them. And again, it is disappointing that neither Brandeis nor KB Homes are willing to be here to answer your questions. In a court of law, you're not supposed to draw an inference when someone declines to testify, but we're not a court of law, and I think that inference is not unfair.